I'm Ari Redboard, and this is TRM Talks. I am Global Head of Policy at TRM Labs. At TRM, we provide blockchain intelligence software to support law enforcement investigations and to help financial institutions and cryptocurrency businesses mitigate financial crime risk within the emerging digital asset economy. Prior to joining TRM, I spent 15 years in the U.S. federal government, first as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice, and then as a Treasury Department official, where I worked to safeguard the financial system against terrorist financiers, weapons of mass destruction proliferators, drug kingpins, and other rogue actors. On TRM Talks, I sit down with business leaders, policymakers, investigators, and friends from across the crypto ecosystem who are working to build a safer financial system. On today's TRM Talks, I sit down with Circle's head of APAC, Yam Ki Chan. But first, inside the lab, where I share data-driven insights from our blockchain intelligence team. In late May 2025, OFAC designated Funnel Technology Inc., a Philippine-based tech firm, and its administrator, Lou Lizzie, as especially designated nationals for supporting crypto investment fraud, specifically pig butchering schemes, infecting over 400,000 scam websites globally and causing more than $200 million in U.S. victim losses. The move marks a pivotal shift, enforcement targeting not only scammers, but the technical infrastructure that enables them. Funnel's operation was a classic example of infrastructure laundering. It purchased IP addresses in bulk from legitimate cloud providers, then resold them to fraud operators. The company also generated fake domain names via algorithmic tools and provided web templates to impersonate trusted platforms. Some of its infrastructure was even used to redirect legitimate websites visitors to scam and gambling sites, facilitating Chinese-linked money laundering operations connected to North Korea. OFAC included 2 cryptocurrency addresses in the designation, one on Ethereum and one on Tron, which have totaled over 4 million in transactions to date. Those funds show both direct ties to WeWanPay, a FinCEN-designated money laundering concern, and indirect exposure to known pig butchering groups and forced scam compounds. U.S. Deputy Treasury Secretary Michael Falkender emphasized that disrupting infrastructure providers like Funnel is essential to dismantling the broader ecosystem of crypto-enabled investment fraud. The U.S.'s government is pivoting from targeting individuals to also undermining the operational backbone of large-scale schemes. For much more, read TRM's in-depth report on our blog. And now, I sit down with Yam Ki Chan. Yam Ki, thank you so much for joining me. I have really been excited to talk to you on TRM Talks.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's truly an honor to be on this platform and to do it with you specifically, because I think you're one of the few people in this industry that, similar to me, can bring a lot of different experiences together.
As we dig in here, and we're going to go pretty deep on a couple topics, just talk a little bit about your journey. It is really extraordinary, really unique. Talk a little bit about sort of how did you get into crypto? How did you end up really leading the team in Singapore for Circle?
Well, it's a great question. And it's funny that my earlier part of the career is me seeking advice. And I now know that I'm old when people come to me for advice, and they're usually starting with this sort of question. And the honest truth is that I fell into it ass backwards. This industry didn't exist, 20, 30 years ago. It kind of came to be really from the Bitcoin days. But in this current iteration, the last, especially stablecoin, the last 5 or 6 years, thankfully for me, I had a number of things in my life that brought it together, where I got to work at the intersection of finance, technology, policy, and international kind of all come together. Maybe a way to kind of start on this is, I'm an immigrant kid to the United States. I was born in Hong Kong. My family applied to the US. It took them, 8, 9 years to get approval because it was through family immigration. And we landed in Chicago with not a whole lot, and me plug it into kind of public school in inner city Chicago and try to navigate like how to learn English and how to think of this new world that we're in. During that period of time, it was the early 90s, was the beginning of the internet in the United States. One of the things I gravitated towards for some reason was the computers and technology. And I found myself working in different organizations as a kid, just helping people to fix computers. Eventually at school, I helped my high school build their email system and DNS servers and web servers. This was built on Netscape back when Netscape was really
Sure.
popular. And that was a part of who I was as a kid. Then eventually, as I went through high school and college, I ended up getting into economics and studying abroad. And my first job out of college was actually investment banking in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley, in semiconductors in particular, like in the heart of Silicon Valley, which at the time, semiconductors wasn't hot, right? It was enterprise software. It was the days of Google going public. But I learned a lot about technology and how that works and how to enable businesses, not just in the Valley, but elsewhere to build. And I ended up leaving banking, worked in China for a couple of years through a program called Princeton in Asia that sent fellows to different companies and organizations, worked as a CEO there to build that business, and went to graduate school focusing on international finance policy. And I've always been thinking through I'm living in between these worlds, between US and Asia. There's so much that's happening and we misunderstand one another. Where do I go to improve that? And of course, in graduate school, happened to be in international finance policy. And coming out of it, got an offer to work at the US Treasury Department. And I fell into the policy work. Yes, I wrote my essay going into grad school, focusing on policy. I didn't think that it would actually get there. But sometimes you manifest it. And the next thing you know, I'm now briefing the Treasury Secretary on different things. And
It's absolutely awesome. And, obviously the finance piece and the business and the technology, combined, and then you take that to Treasury from a policy perspective. What was your role? What were you doing at Treasury when you were there?
so there's this group called International Affairs, which is essentially the financial diplomats of the United States. This is the group that looks at how economies are operating, how are they functioning, are they working well, what's the balance of payments, the risks to them from a macro perspective, exchange rate issues, IMF programs, World Bank programs. It also is the group that leads on a lot of the economic negotiations with the rest of the world. And I started as an international economist focusing on Central America. And then I moved to a group called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. That was probably my first exposure to really deep national security work and thinking about the intersection of economic policy and investments together with national security and how to bring an interagency together to come to an agreement on certain things. Then I was tapped to work on the US-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue, the SNED, which was the highest level cabinet conversation between the US and China. And I started under Secretary Geithner at the tail end of his tenure, and then helped support Secretary Liu in his establishment of the relationship with the Chinese policymakers, folks like Yam Ki Chan, Wang Yang, the vice premiers, and then of course setting up meetings for him with President Xi Jinping and others in the Chinese government and working through all of the negotiations.
What an extraordinary experience and just so much relevant perspective to what's happening in the world today, I imagine, as you sort of see geopolitics unfolding everywhere.
I feel really lucky. It was not something that I planned for. It wasn't like I was 12 and I said, I'm going to go work in the
Yeah.
government. I mean, to be honest, I was an immigrant kid trying to figure out how to learn English and how to get my family through all of the bureaucracy of signing up for school lunches and stuff like that. But it's not lost on me. After Treasury, or rather as part of my Treasury experience, one of my mentors happened to then join the White House National Security Council and pulled me over to help support their work on all of the Asia economic work. And I remember just thinking really thoughtfully about this, that what an unusual world that they have a kid who was born in Hong Kong that became a naturalized American citizen that are negotiating with the Chinese government on behalf of the United States. What country would allow
Yeah.
for this? So extraordinary privilege.
So you spent some time at the National Security Council, which I imagine also really sort of built those national security, global competitiveness, these chops, right?
Well, what's interesting about the group that I was at, it's called Intercon, International Economics. And it was something that was created under the Clinton administration. And if I remember my history correctly, Larry Summers, Rubin, and others are the one who kind of created this group. And it was coming out of the Cold War, the United States thought about how do we marry the economic might of the United States and the national security part. So this group, it's part of National Security Council, but it's also part of National Economic Council. So I reported into both. On the econ side, I reported into Jeff Zients, who eventually became the chief of staff for President Biden. And then on the security side to Susan Rice. And I literally just go back and forth between the two groups, explaining guns to people who sell butter and people who sell butter what guns are and how to balance that
Yeah,
power of the United States to shape the world and influence it in a way that is for global prosperity.
it's really extraordinary. Interestingly, when I was at Treasury, this crazy project called Libra launched, and the US Treasury Department and US policymakers on Capitol Hill went absolutely crazy. But really, what it started was this conversation about what a stable asset that moves on blockchains, backed by fiat currency, could ultimately mean to the world. Was there a moment for you when you saw this and said, hey, this is the type of thing, or this is the type of company, when we're talking about Circle, that married your passion for computers and technology with this international policy passion?
So this is going to probably be sacrilege for especially your audience, but I was hugely skeptical of digital assets back then with crypto, right? When it
Sure.
first started. Because I imagine sitting in the Treasury Department and then eventually at the National Security Council, like someone just created these new things like fiat, like literally fiat money, I guess, in this instance, and who kind of backs it. It was really hard to wrap my mind around. And immediately I was thinking, none of the central banks would go for this, or at
Yeah.
least very few that I can think of, because they lose monetary sovereignty, the ability to control money supply, interest rates, one of the key drivers of economic growth and business cycles. This is going to be really, really difficult. So it's a bit of an irony that I find myself now at Circle.
How did that happen?
So after the Treasury and the White House, I left US government and joined Google. And actually first joined Google in Hong Kong and then in Singapore. And that was really cool. I mean, as someone who back in the younger days worked in Silicon Valley and watched the
Yeah.
Google IPO, it's a great opportunity to be in the depths of a large technology company. And more importantly, even when I was in government, during the last few years of the Obama administration, technology competition was becoming a major theme and topic in the economic conversation. The issues around in China, they had this thing called secure and controllable. There was a Made in China 2025 program. All of these things were shaping the economic policy and some of the national security policy. And in the White House, we had to bring in experts to help educate us on how to think about this. Like, what is the timeline? What is really the competitive advantage? Like, how hard is it to do certain things? So when an opportunity came that I could actually be in one of the largest technology companies and soak that up, I took that opportunity. And after about 5-6 years at Google, Circle was reaching out. They needed someone to work on policy. And I got a call with Dante, and I said, this is a terrific guy. And I understood better what stablecoins are and how they really can change the way money movement works and what it means for creating economic prosperity. And then therefore it was an easy decision. It wasn't that hard at all. And really glad to be a part of this company story.
I love that. Talk me through stablecoins a little bit. What is it about this ability to now transfer value cross-border to reach really the unbanked corners of the world potentially? But how do you see sort of the mission at Circle and what you're able to build from a business perspective?
I think first and foremost is to situate what stablecoins are and what it isn't. And there's a lot of misconceptions around it, and not all stablecoins are created equal. So first and foremost, stablecoin is just an evolution of money that have been going through the process of being digitized over time. From the very beginning of money of shells and hard metals, eventually to paper forms and other things, and then digitally sitting at your bank account or in your Venmo app, if you're in the United States. This is just an evolution of that to be on a database that is now more accessible globally and more efficient than closed loop networks that are sitting in these different bank accounts that doesn't interact with one another. Right? Even though you're on Venmo and I'm on PayPal, for me to send you money isn't that easy. We have to wait, a couple of days for that to happen, and that's within the same company. It's kind of odd. Right? It shouldn't really work that way. So there are these friction that's embedded in the way digital money is, and what blockchain brings, as well as with stablecoin, is a way to upgrade digital money to a better form that's more efficient. So that's one thing. The other piece is this form of digital money is only good, as in trusted and safe, if it is truly backed one-to-one. that there's no funny money that's being created. And Circle's approach to this was, number one, to go through and work with the regulators. That was really important for the firm, and it's really important for me as a former government official. The second piece is there are reserves that you can see that are attested by third parties of where it is, what's there, and it's on a regular basis that you can trust it. So when you have all of these things in place, what it now does is that businesses and network firms can now think of, how do I move value in ways that I couldn't before? That is, number one, allowing me to touch more users than previously, because the user acquisition costs in the past in the technology world was really high. And the two-sided network is the merchant acquisition part. That's also really high. And now you can actually lower that cost because now we're operating on one network as opposed to different separated networks that are designed to be separate. The other piece is that for businesses in Asia in particular, some interesting stats. 75% of trade invoicing in Asia is denominated in the dollar. This is according to the Federal Reserve. And that includes all of the trade in Asia, including trade from China, some of which are denominated in renminbi. So when you remove that, the number is probably higher. That if you walk into any firm in Asia and you open up their virtual cabinet and pull an invoice, is denominated in US dollar. So these are firms that needs to have access to dollars to be able to buy supplies and to be able to collect dollars so that they can get revenue in a quick and fast way. And they've been sitting around working with various institutions that takes like 2 or 3 or 4 days to get money to them or to pay out. And what that means is that this is money that sits as working capital on their balance sheet or at bank accounts that they can't use to deploy on buying inventory, paying payrolls, investment in CapEx and other things. So you're unlocking that for these businesses. On the user side, let's take remittances. The World Bank estimates that to move $200 into the Asia region, on average, the cost is just around 6%. That's $12 to move $200 into Asia. And this is usually the most vulnerable in the population that needs to be sending these remittances at the low amounts. And they're spending a high percentage of their costs and waiting sometimes days to get that money. Stablecoins is a way to address that, to shrink that time and have quicker conversions. On trade financing, the Asia Development Bank estimates that the trade financing gap in Asia is around $510 billion. That means that there's certain firms that are ready to produce and sell to the world, economic activity that doesn't happen because they can't get credit, especially in dollar forms, quick enough in order to invest in the inventory and the machinery to do that trade. So it was just so obvious when you think about bringing all of that together, the economic activity and the creation of wealth and revenue for the region was significant.
One thing that you guys, I think, do really well and need to is really tell the story. And those were awesome examples. I remember being in your booth at the Singapore FinTech Festival last year, and you actually had these sort of, it was storytelling. The booth was created with walls that each had sort of stories or examples of how USDC is being used in the world. What jumps out at you as just really cool sort of case studies and things that you guys are working on or partnerships that you have to use USDC?
So one of those partnerships is Tunes. Tunes is a company based in Asia, but they're global, and they do money movement for a number of different companies around the world and for merchants and individuals through these partners. So MoneyGram, Remitly, Western Unions are the type of customers. And essentially what they do is when these firms send them dollars, they will be able to pay out in local currency near instant around the world. But what was happening is that they were pre-funding all of this in different bank accounts, and they were eating that cost. And then they have to wait for the money to arrive at their bank account in the US or Europe, and then send that money back out to the region when they can. So what they're doing is they're using USDC as a way to move those funds more quickly and then to be able to pay out to different partners around the region in USDC. One of those areas is their partners in parts of Africa. They used to have to spend 5 days or 7 days of pre-funding because the banking rails going into Africa were unpredictable. That even though the SWIFT confirmation has happened, the money hasn't arrived yet. So you have to kind of call around to figure out, well, where did it get stuck? Which correspondent bank are you using? Maybe it's someone who just didn't hit approve in some computer system for it to be released. And now they can send USDC to their partners on the ground and it settles T0 as opposed to T5. Huge economic unlock for them in terms of timing. And then for their users to be able to get funds more quickly.
Really extraordinary. It's interesting. One thing I think we're seeing in the space, or certainly I'm seeing, is that business leaders, CEOs, CROs are becoming policy experts because we're literally building the regulatory frameworks globally for the crypto ecosystem. I mean, it's happening before our eyes. The US is really just the latest example, but you've gone through this with MAS in Singapore. We've seen it in Japan, Korea, in Dubai, and elsewhere. You are slightly different in that you are bringing policy expertise to a business role at Circle. You have so many different remits in terms of what you're working on. But I think what's also so interesting about APAC, and Angela Ang, my colleague, hammers this home to me all the time, is that it's a region with a lot of different countries, with a lot of different cultures, with a lot of different regulatory frameworks. How do you think about navigating that, both from sort of a regulatory perspective and also that business perspective as you're building?
Well, first, for every executive out there, it is a must to have policy and business in your head. The days of just purely being a business person and let someone else deal with the policy, it's gone out the window. It's not possible in the world that we live in. Conversely, if you're a policymaker or someone who focuses on policymaking within a company without the business mindset, without what it means for the economy, that doesn't work either.
I could not agree with you more on all these points.
Yeah. Hence, you have people that are citizens around the world that have discontent with the policies because they're saying, "Look, your policies are not helping me drive my growth and support my family and create opportunities for my children." And therefore, there is these upheavals in different parts of society. They're saying like the policies are not working. I want to change it all. And therefore, I think it's really important for leaders to understand that like you have to understand it all, and you have to be able to bring it together and be conversant in the risks and the upsides of these dimensions. Now, I think specific to what I do, how I think about this part of the world and the nuances is that in Asia in particular, we mentioned the fragmentation. Asia is 30 some countries. It's 30 plus different currencies. Every single country has a different regulatory structure, different 3-letter, 4-letter, or 5-letter regulator that has a combination of central banking or banking regulation, insurance, et cetera. The US has a lot. Like most companies spend a lot of time in the US. But then when they look at the world, I think a lot of US companies forget that like this fragmentation, this challenge makes it hard to kind of navigate. And it's easy to clump through together a large set of countries and say, oh, this is the Asia market. But really to be able to be successful in these markets require some local context and customization. And herein lies the tension. In Silicon Valley, in US companies, the natural instinct is to build something once and scale it globally. I've seen this at Google. I've seen it at other large companies. It's like, we've got the best answer because we've like built the most efficient model and the most efficient like path, and it works great and everyone should use it. They're not completely wrong. The challenge is that when you get to the other side of the world, the user behavior is a little different. What you are seeing now is that as countries in Asia, also in other parts of the world, move from being lower income or lower middle income into middle income and upper middle income, they now have the talent and the companies to really innovate. And what they're saying is, look, Google, yes, search, but our user behaviors here are different. People don't have fancy phones to load YouTube or load Google Photos. They have, two gigabyte, hard drives on their phone or 2 gigabyte storage as opposed to like 256. The whole mechanism of how they operate, the constraints force them to build differently. And the thing that these companies based in Asia are doing, and when you see it in Grab, you see it in Kakao, you see it in Ant, is that they specialize in these local markets and they really craft that experience and they can dominate in that market. And they create a moat around them that it makes it really hard for someone who's trying to take something generic. Yes, it's global, but into the local market, there's going to be some disconnect. And these companies are bringing together these different parts and then bringing it all together on the back end to create connectivity.
It's amazing. And, we've thought about this from day one at TRM in terms of where we want to build. And I think what compounds this issue is the nature of crypto, which is cross-border value transfer at the speed of the internet. It is international, global by nature. It has to be everywhere, right? Or it's nowhere. And I feel like that almost adds this other issue on top of technology, where you feel like you really want to make sure that you're everywhere really from the beginning. How have you dealt with that challenge when it comes to building Circle in particular in Asia?
Well, I think a lot about where do I want to be in the stack and how do we work with partners that have that distribution at the local level that knows the local market. So all the companies that we work with, they are specialists in their own market, knowing their merchants, their users, their particular use case. What we try to do is allow USDC and the infrastructure that we have to be that background plumbing for them. So they build that experience, they interact with the user. And they're the one that understand how a user moves through an app and how they go from A to B to C. The movement of value, they can just use USDC on the back end to do, but we don't have to be at the front foot of that. These are the companies that know how trade financing flow actually works on the ground. We want to understand it, but we want to figure out, okay, what are the pain points for them and for their end users? And how do we create partnerships and programs to support and address that pain point using USDC or Circle Wallet, some of our technologies, Circle Payments Network, to address the pain that they have. So we're a little more behind the scenes. In this context of the differences in cultures and markets, you have to know where the competitive advantages are. And there are going to be other companies that do this better than you. So how do you work with those as opposed to try to create your own?
You mentioned in the last question sort of the nuance around the different jurisdictions in APAC. And this is going to be a hard question for someone who runs all across the region. Are there a couple jurisdictions, one or two or three jurisdictions that like get you really excited right now, whether it's about adoption, is it regulation? Where are you having sort of the coolest conversations or you're seeing the most interesting activity at the moment in region?
Well, first of all, I would say that for Circle globally, the passage of the Genius Act and companies going public again just created an enormous set of inbound for us all around the world. Every publicly listed company that has a really good board is asking their management team, what is your stablecoin strategy? What are you doing in this area? Whether you're a bank, e-commerce site, big tech enterprise, oil and gas company, everyone is asking like, how do you leverage this? And these are companies that I think were dabbling on the edges, but now with that clarity in the US happening, are jumping with both feet and trying to figure something out. Out here in the region, we are, of course, structured in first and foremost in Singapore. We're licensed here. And there are lots of money movement companies as well as asset managers and OTC desks that are based here that are working with us, not just in the region, but also globally. Lots of activities. What's happening though is that the other countries are also developing rules on stablecoin. Japan is the first country in the world to actually pass a law on stablecoin. And USDC so far is the only approved stablecoin to be used in Japan by the FSA. And we spent quite a bit of time to work with the regulators to enable that. Fascinating place. It's the fourth largest economy in the world, an enormous amount of trade and FX, and a close US ally. So a lot of trade happens in dollars. We're working with Japanese companies looking at, in Japan, but also their operations outside of Japan, because they are buying and selling goods in parts of Africa, in Middle East, in Europe, in Latin America. These are huge businesses thinking through like, how do we make our company more efficient? Hong Kong passed this law, really critical market because Hong Kong remains the gateway in and out of China, mainland China. And it is also one of the largest, if not the largest capital market that's open in Asia. It's also the only city with same day dollar clearing in Asia. No other city has that. When you pay somebody in dollars in Hong Kong through a bank, it settles on the same day, as opposed to waiting 2 days or longer. So it gives Hong Kong a pretty unique advantage. And there are tons of companies within Hong Kong that are building using USDC to support their treasury for their global business. So this could be a company somewhere in Asia, but they want to be based in Hong Kong for their treasury management for either tax reasons or the dollar rails. And they're collecting money in Europe and in the US. And they want to move it and shift it to Hong Kong. And then they pay for vendors out in Southeast Asia and Latin America and Africa. And they do that in dollars. So that's really fascinating. There are tons of payments processors sitting in Hong Kong that are doing work. And a lot of companies are sitting in Hong Kong, but they actually do work in the rest of the world. But their bank accounts are just structured in Hong Kong because of the banking rail advantages and a lot of banks being available there. Then you have Korea. that had a presidential election, and it was a 180-degree turn with the new presidency. And now they have not one but two competing bills on stablecoins. And the rumor on the street is that there will be at least one or two more moving in the legislature. So they will have a stablecoin law in place fairly soon. And the interest in Korea are pretty significant around digital assets and stablecoins. So I'm hopeful that as this regulatory clarity happens, more and more enterprises in particular and banks comes into this space. And it creates actually an interesting shift in the market, because it's not a surprise to you, but the dominant uses of blockchain finance had largely been on the crypto trading side in the past. And what we're seeing, especially out in Asia, is that utility use of stablecoin. And that's picking up significantly. And that's what I'm excited to build out here.
That's the most exciting part of the space. I've said this for years. It's payments. And obviously you guys are right in the middle of that. At the beginning of this, you sort of mentioned Genius, and I just want to spend like a minute on it. We've talked about it a lot on here, but I thought you had an interesting comment. And I imagine your background is a US regulator and policymaker. And now in your role, regulators and business leaders must look to you and say, hey, can you walk us through a little bit of what's happening in the United States? How interested are regulators, business leaders across Asia on what's happening in the United States right now in terms of this just acceleration of crypto legislation, of crypto policy making, of conversations around crypto? How much does Genius come up in the conversations that you're having in Asia, whether it's with policymakers or business leaders?
All the time.
Wow.
One thing that we have the privilege of seeing, either living and working overseas or having been in the US government, is the extraordinary privilege that we have as the United States to shape much of the rules around the world, and in particular, rules on financial services. And you can debate whether the United States deserve it, but it is a reflection of what it is today. And because of that, many countries look to the US as a guidepost of what is permitted or not permitted. And while stablecoins and use of stablecoin has been pretty prolific in Asia and emerging markets, some of the tier one regulators, as well as the biggest firms in the region, had always had a little bit of hesitancy until the US can get the clarity it needs in place around stablecoin. And now we have it. So this has really shifted the conversation, especially at the board level, who have been hearing about it and thinking about it. And now the risk committees of the boards of management teams can take a more informed look at what this really is and what to consider a well-structured stablecoin and a regulated stablecoin, and which companies to work with. So that's a huge part of my conversation.
I heard Dante say something, I think, around Genius essentially codifies our business model. It's cool to see just a great product married with the right mission and the right team. And it's been so much fun for me to watch the last really 5+ years as you guys have grown. I'm going to end with this. I think that folks mostly know you as a policy expert, business leader, a stablecoin evangelist, but you're also a really fun guy. We have partied together. We have hosted many dinners all over the world together. What do you do when you're not? I think you're probably 24/7 circle these days, but what do you do to relax a little bit, to have a good time?
Yeah, the blockchain never sleeps. Well, I have 2 young kids, so I try to spend as much time as I can with my family and the kids, whether it's cycling around, getting out there, exploring different parts of either Singapore or the region. That's one of the perks of living in Asia is Singapore is a small city. So a half an hour flight will get you to a different country with a different currency, with a different language. So I try to do that with my family and kids. The other piece is, now, trying to stay fit. And I know you, Ari, you do this not only when you're in the US, but when you're out and about in all the conference circuit running.
Singapore is the all-time greatest, TRM run club.
Yeah, and then the other part is, and it's part of who I am, is I really do enjoy the dinners with friends, and not because it's just dinners. I learned so much from talking to people. The one thing I've learned in my life is we all come from different experiences and different walks of life. What you see at that very moment is the latest snapshot of who that person is, whether they are, a head of policy for a blockchain analysis company, or they may be a crypto whale, or they may be head of a CEO, but really they've lived through some really unique experiences. And there's so much of the world that I don't understand. And talking to these friends really helps me learn and think about, oh, what are the interesting problems to solve and where the gaps are and how can I be helpful in solving those problems? So
I love that so much. It's an extraordinary answer. And I'll tell you, funny enough, it's the thing I love by far the most about TRM Talks. So yeah, thank you so much for joining TRM Talks. I look forward to doing this again soon.
it's been a real pleasure, and I can't wait to see you out here in the region again.
You know, it's interesting. I've known Yam Ki for a long time and through a number of different really critical roles. And, we talk a lot about careers and the trajectory of careers on TRM Talks. And I think his was one of the most interesting, right? From Treasury to ultimately Circle in a really critical policy role as we saw the growth of stablecoins throughout APAC, but then to really pivot into a business role where he's leading the entire Circle team across APAC. I think it's just such a great story in terms of, taking that policy expertise, marrying it with the business acumen, and really building something at Circle. And I think more and more we're seeing business leaders in our space in cryptocurrency, whether it's CEOs at exchanges or stablecoin issuers, have real knowledge and expertise on the policy side because it's so important. And Circle in particular, that is always really built with regulation, with compliance in mind. I think it's really interesting to see someone come from Treasury and ultimately lead a business function at Circle in this way. So Yam Ki's story to me, obviously the expertise is so deep and you heard that today, but I really love the career story. Like there's so much you can do to grow a career if you're really, really good at your job. On the next TRM Talks, I sit down with the Vice President of International Policy at Coinbase, Tom Duff Gordon. If you love the show, leave a review wherever you're listening to it. And follow us on LinkedIn to get the latest news on crypto regulation, compliance, and investigations.
TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. This episode was produced in partnership with Voltage Productions. The music for this show was provided by Ecolix.
Now, let's get back to building.